The day I served the HOA president a trespassing notice for hosting her lake parade on my property was the first time I saw Brenda McMillan speechless. This was the same woman who once tried to fine me $5,000 for using the lake. So I bought the lake. Now she owes me $1.8 million. Yeah. It escalated. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and buckle up. Because this is the story of how a pontoon power trip became the biggest backfire of Brenda McMillan's life. My name's Mark. A few years ago I considered myself semi-retired. I'd done well in real estate, nothing flashy like skyscrapers but solid work, revitalizing forgotten properties, tricky acquisitions, rezoning dead commercial strips. That kind of thing teaches you patience, attention to detail, and above all, the importance of reading the fine print. Especially in dusty deeds and obscure bylaws. My wife Claire and I moved to the Serenity Lakes community for just that, serenity. A small, comfortable home with modest lake frontage, perfect for our little electric pontoon boat, the Wanderer. It wasn't fancy but it was ours. For 2 beautiful years, we used it for sunset cruises, quiet fishing trips, and making memories with the grandkids. And for 2 years the HOA, headed by one Brenda McMillan, seemed harmless. Her biggest concerns were lawn length and mailbox colors. But I should have known better. Brenda was waiting, biding her time, playing queen bee to her little hive. The showdown began on a flawless Saturday in late July. Not a cloud in the sky, the lake shimmered, and a soft breeze made everything feel like a postcard. Clara was out visiting her sister, so I decided to take the Wanderer out for a solo spin. Just me, the water, and some peace. About an hour in, I was drifting near the center of the lake when a much larger pontoon, chromed out, leather-seated, and twice as obnoxious, roared up beside me. At the helm? Brenda McMillan. Wearing oversized sunglasses, a violent caftan, and her signature expression, tight-lipped disapproval. 2 other women flanked her, familiar faces from HOA meetings. Her loyal understudies in self-importance. "Mr. Thompson, isn't it?" she called across the water, voice sharp and smug. I smiled. "Yes, Brenda. Lovely day, isn't it?" She ignored the nicety. "Are you aware," she began, voice rising, "that lake use for pontoon activities is reserved for members of the Serenity Lake Preservation Club?" I blinked. "The what club?" "The Preservation Club," she repeated slowly like I was dim. "It's for residents who contribute to the lake's well-being. Members are granted priority access for recreational use." She eyed my humble boat as if it were leaking oil into the water. "This area is designated for club activities," she added, gesturing toward me with theatrical disdain. "This is the first I've heard of any such restriction," I said, keeping my tone even. "When we moved in, the bylaws were clear. The lake is for all residents." Her lips tightened. "Things changed, Mr. Thompson. Perhaps you missed the memo." She smiled, falsely, then gunned her boat's engine and tore off, leaving a wake that rocked the Wanderer more than a little. I was confused, irritated, but not especially worried. That changed the following Tuesday. I received a certified letter from the Serenity Lakes HOA Enforcement Division, which sounded way more serious than anything I'd ever seen from our sleepy little office. Inside was a violation notice, printed on heavy cream paper, embossed with the HOA seal. It stated that I, Mark Thompson, had violated Section 7, Subsection B, Paragraph 3 of the Lake Usage Regulations by operating an unpermitted watercraft in a designated club activity zone. The fine. $5,000. Due in 30 days. I actually laughed out loud. Then reread it. Then stopped laughing. $5,000? For taking my own boat on our shared lake? What club zone? What section? I pulled out my copy of the HOA Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, the CC&RS. I'd read them thoroughly before buying. There was a general section on lake usage, sure. But nothing like this exclusive club business. The notice included an attached addendum, clearly fake. It was a single-page, low-quality, with freshly printed regulations and signatures from Brenda and Harold Jenkins, the HOA treasurer, better known for his flower garden than financial savvy. No adoption date. No record of a vote. No legal backing. Clara was stunned. $5,000 for a boat ride? Mark, this is nuts. It was worse than nuts. It was an abuse of power. An obvious, flagrant overreach. But if Brenda thought I was going to just roll over and pay up, she had seriously, catastrophically, underestimated me. That night, I didn't just reread the CC and RS. I practically memorized them. I dug into state laws on HOA governance. I started cross-referencing, highlighting, taking notes. What started as frustration grew into resolve. I wasn't just going to fight this fine. I was going to dismantle this nonsense at the root. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about principle. And if there's one thing my real estate career taught me, it's that principle, when properly applied, can do more than win arguments. It can buy lakes. Want to hear how I bought the lake out from under Brenda's nose and made her regret ever crossing me? Stick around. It gets better. And she's in a meeting. Brenda, it seemed, was perpetually in a meeting. Finally, I managed to corner George Peterson while he was out walking his elderly golden retriever. George was a retired accountant, lived a few streets over, and was generally a decent guy, mild-mannered, conflict-averse, the sort who apologized if you bumped into him. When I brought up the fine and the so-called Preservation Club, George shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Well, Mark, he began, clearly stalling. Brenda, she's very passionate about the lake. Says it needs protecting. The club's her idea. Raises funds for, beautification. I pressed him. George, are these rules even legitimate? Were they voted on? Are they part of our official CC and RS? Because this doesn't feel like beautification. It feels like extortion. George sighed and finally met my eyes, a weary resignation etched into his face. Look, between you and me, Brenda pretty much runs the show. She convinced most of the board that this was necessary. The club has its own accounts, it's supposed to go toward lake projects. As for the rules, she presented them as an urgent operational update. Most of us just went along. It's easier than arguing with her. His words, maybe intended to placate, only strengthened my resolve. Easier for the board meant unjust for the rest of us. And then there was that club account, separate, not transparently reported in the HOA's annual financials. That didn't sit right. If they were collecting dues or donations, where was the money going? That's when my professional instincts kicked in. If the HOA was playing fast and loose with its own rules, then the answer wasn't within the HOA. It was beneath it. Literally. Ownership. Who actually owned the lake? In communities like ours, ownership histories can get messy. Sometimes the developer retains ownership, sometimes it's deeded to the HOA, sometimes it ends up with the county or a special district. What if Brenda's claim to control the lake wasn't just illegitimate, it was baseless? I started at the county recorder's office with our plat maps and legal descriptions. I spent the better part of a day combing through dusty ledgers and digital archives. My background in real estate gave me an edge. I knew what I was looking for. Chains of title, easements, dedications, any records of transfer involving the lakebed. And the deeper I dug, the more fascinating it got. The original developer, Lakeside Living Incorporated, had created the subdivision and the lake back in the late 1970s. They'd recorded covenants and formed the HOA, but there was no clear deed transferring the lakebed to the HOA. Easements for resident access, yes. But actual ownership? It wasn't there. Then I discovered Lakeside Living had gone bankrupt in the mid-1980s, hardly unusual for that era. Their remaining assets were either sold off or abandoned. Could the lake have been one of those forgotten assets? I expanded the search, state records, old bankruptcy filings, tax archives. It was like untangling a ball of legal spaghetti. But I was determined. Eventually I found it, a transfer of miscellaneous non-performing assets to a holding trust during Lakeside Living's bankruptcy, a catch-all liquidation maneuver. One of those assets was a vaguely described water parcel that, when cross-referenced with maps, aligned almost exactly with Serenity Lake. The trust, Serenity Lake Holdings Trust, had quietly paid minimal taxes for a few years before going completely dormant. The trustees? Long deceased. The entity? Legally alive but practically forgotten. A ghost. Which meant Brenda McMillan had been parading around, wielding control over an amenity the HOA never actually owned. It was like a shot of adrenaline. Next step, confirm if the trust had any living beneficiaries or administrators, and if so, whether they'd be willing to sell. I hired a property research firm I'd worked with before, pros at navigating these kinds of legal mazes. Told them I was interested in acquiring a distressed water asset. Provided the trust details. In the meantime, I spoke with some of the oldest residents in the community. One of them, Mrs. Henderson, remembered the very beginning. "Oh, that lake," she said with a fond chuckle. "Back then it was just there. Open to everyone. That nice young man from the developer, Mr. Carmichael? He always said the lake was for the whole community. No clubs. No nonsense." Her words echoed what I'd already begun to suspect. The so-called Preservation Club was a sham. A tool for Brenda to consolidate power, and possibly skim funds off the top. Where was that money going? Our annual HOA financials had always been vague about specific lake expenditures. General maintenance? Sure. But this club with its own account run by Brenda? It smelled like a slush fund. But first, ownership. A week later, the research firm called me. Jackpot. They'd tracked down the descendants of the trust's final known trustee, living several states away. They had no idea the trust included an entire lake. To them, it was a dusty file and the occasional nominal tax bill their lawyer handled. No interest in managing it. No emotional attachment. And certainly no idea who Brenda McMillan was. When my intermediary gently asked whether they might be interested in divesting this odd relic of a water feature, their answer was cautiously optimistic. They were more than happy to be rid of a legal nuisance they didn't even realize they still had. I stood at my window, gazing out across Brenda's little aquatic kingdom, a grin spreading across my face. "Oh, Brenda," I murmured. "You have no idea what's coming." The moment I had confirmation that they were willing to sell, I knew I had her. This wasn't just about a $5,000 fine anymore. This was about correcting a massive abuse of power, and yes, I'll admit it, the delicious irony of the whole thing was intoxicating. I made one call, to Sarah Evans. Top-tier real estate and corporate lawyer. Smart, ruthless when needed, and trustworthy. I laid everything out. Brenda, the bogus club, the lake, the trust, and my plan to buy it out from under her. When I finished, Sarah leaned back in her chair, a smirk forming. "Mark," she said, "this is monumentally bold, and potentially gloriously messy. Are you sure? Buying a lake to settle a score with an HOA president? That's like nuking a fly." I grinned. "Maybe. But that fly has drawn blood, and it's buzzing in everyone's ear. Besides, this isn't just a vendetta anymore. It's principle. And frankly, owning a lake might be a sound long-term investment." Sarah nodded. "All right. Principle it is. And maybe a dash of spectacularly satisfying revenge. I'm in." We set up a new LLC, bland, nondescript, completely disconnected from me, Watershed Properties LLC. Perfect. Negotiations with the trust beneficiaries were delicate. They were surprised someone wanted the lake but had no clue of its current value to the community. Sarah kept things vague, framing it as a routine land acquisition for an investment group. The goal was clear. Avoid tipping them off that their forgotten water body was the centerpiece of a high-value HOA neighborhood. We ran the title search. The survey came back clean. And just like that, the trust transferred ownership of the lake to Watershed Properties LLC. The Serenity Lakes HOA, Brenda McMillan, never owned the lake at all. But I did now. And things were just getting started. After several rounds of negotiation, we finally settled on a price. It was sizable as one would expect. Lakes, even forgotten ones, don't come cheap. But it was well within my means and, frankly, a bargain considering the strategic value it held in this unfolding drama. More than that, I saw its potential as a responsibly managed asset for the community. Clara was both supportive and slightly incredulous. "So you're actually going to own the lake?" she asked one evening, eyes wide. "The whole thing." I grinned. "The whole darn puddle, sweetheart?" She shook her head, a blend of disbelief and admiration in her expression. "Brenda McMillan is going to have a conniption," she murmured. "That," I replied, "would be putting it mildly." While Sarah worked on finalizing the purchase agreement under the name Watershed Properties LLC, I began laying the groundwork for what would come next. The first step? I paid the $5,000 fine, under protest. I sent the check with a registered letter, explicitly stating that I considered the fine illegitimate and was only paying it to avoid further punitive actions or liens, pending a full legal review. The move served two purposes. It defused Brenda's expectations of resistance and lulled her into thinking she'd won. And importantly, it established clear damages for any future lawsuit. According to George Peterson's wife, who happened to be a friend of Clara's and, conveniently, not a fan of Brenda's autocratic tendencies, Brenda was positively insufferable after that. Mr. Thompson finally saw reason, she'd apparently said at the next casual board get-together. "People just need to understand who's in charge for things to run smoothly." Oh, Brenda, you really had no idea. While the legal machinery behind the lake acquisition ground forward, I turned into a full-time documentarian. Every time the so-called Serenity Lake Preservation Club held one of its smug little events, I was there, camera in hand, discreetly recording. Pontoon parties, kayak races, members-only swim gatherings in the prime swimming coves. All of it. I logged dates, times, participant numbers. Captured board members grinning on deck chairs. Each photo, every snippet of video, was evidence. Another nail in the coffin I was crafting for Brenda's regime. Neighbors started giving me odd looks. There I was, sitting on my deck with a long-lens camera, or strolling the shoreline path with a camcorder. Let them wonder. I wasn't just watching birds. The closing happened on a gray Tuesday in late September. No ceremony, just me, Sarah, and a mountain of paperwork signed on behalf of Watershed Properties LLC. When Sarah finally handed over the recorded deed, a deep satisfaction washed over me. I, Mark Thompson, now owned Serenity Lake. For a few days I did nothing. I simply enjoyed it. I'd walk down to the dock, stare out at the calm surface of the water and smile. Brenda and her inner circle were still blissfully unaware that their private playground had a new, very real landlord. Their grand Fall Colors pontoon parade was scheduled for the first Saturday in October. It was perfect timing. Sarah drafted formal trespass notices, demand letters, and invoices. We calculated a reasonable access fee based on private lake memberships and boat rental rates, then multiplied that by the number of people and boats, and the days they'd used the lake since my purchase. The result? Substantial. And justified. We didn't just serve the HOA, we also prepared individual notices for Brenda and each board member I documented using the lake. Their personal liability was the cherry on top. The stage was set. The trap baited. And Brenda McMillan was about to sail her gaudy pontoon boat straight into it. October arrived with crisp, golden perfection. From my deck, I watched the preparations for the parade. Boats festooned with plastic pumpkins and fake fall foliage clustered by the launch ramp. Brenda's barge, the Empress, was of course the crown jewel, blinding in its tacky glory, bearing a massive Serenity Lake Preservation Club members-only banner. Brenda herself stood on deck in a sequined orange and brown sweater that looked like a harvest-themed disco ball. She barked orders with the authority of an admiral, unaware that Sarah and our process server, a no-nonsense man named Mr. Davies, were already en route. At precisely 2 p.m. as the parade reached its peak, Sarah and Mr. Davies arrived at the HOA clubhouse. Brenda wasn't there, she was presiding over her flotilla, of course. Tiffany, the flustered receptionist, hesitantly radioed her. Brenda's annoyance was visible even from a distance as she snapped a reply and handed the radio to one of her lieutenants. Minutes later, a small boat detached from the group and sped toward the shore. Brenda was aboard, looking thoroughly put out. According to Sarah's later recounting, delivered with a lawyer's professional relish, Brenda stormed into the clubhouse. "All right," she snapped. "What could possibly be so important that it requires interrupting the Fall Colors Parade?" Sarah, calm and collected, introduced herself. "Mrs. McMillan, I'm counsel for Watershed Properties LLC, the legal owners of Serenity Lake." Brenda blinked. "Watershed what? Never heard of them. The HOA owns the lake, or I do more or less. What is this nonsense?" Sarah smiled politely. "Perhaps you'd like to examine these documents." Mr. Davies stepped forward and formally served Brenda, first in her capacity as HOA president, then personally. She tore into the first envelope, eyes skimming the top page. Her expression faltered. She flipped through the rest, her face paling by the second. The demand letter was clear. Serenity Lake was private property, owned by Watershed Properties LLC. The letter detailed repeated unauthorized usage, including the club's events, and attached a detailed invoice. Total amount due, $1.8 million. Brenda ripped open the second envelope. Her face, already pale, turned gray. It was a personal notice, detailing her role in organizing these events and assigning her a personal liability of $250,000 for gross negligence and abuse of authority. Witnesses later said Brenda swayed on her feet and gripped the reception desk for balance. This is outrageous," she whispered. "A mistake. It has to be." Sarah, perfectly poised, responded, "There is no mistake, Mrs. McMillan. The deed is enclosed. Feel free to have your attorney review it." Brenda just stood there, speechless, stunned, and for once entirely out of control. The documents trembled in her hands. At that very moment, similar envelopes were being delivered by courier to the homes of every board member who'd so enthusiastically participated in Brenda's little club. From my deck, I watched the Fall Colors pontoon parade dissolve into confusion. Boats drifted without direction. Conversations turned to hushed murmurs. The trap had been sprung. The queen bee was buzzing, but her stinger was gone. She'd sailed straight into a very large, very expensive, and entirely legal spiderweb, and I, Mark Thompson, owner of Watershed Properties LLC, was the spider. The fallout was swift. Brenda McMillan, I heard, spent the rest of Saturday alternately shrieking into her phone at the HOA's dazed attorney, a man named Arthur Jenkins, no relation to Harold of the Petunia fame, and sitting in stunned, furious silence. The other board members, recipients of their own personal trespass notices and invoices ranging from $50,000 to $100,000 based on their involvement, responded with a predictable mix of panic, denial, and outrage. Suddenly, undying loyalty to Brenda didn't seem like the safest hill to die on. By Sunday evening, an emergency HOA board meeting had been called. Word from Mrs. Henderson, who had quietly cultivated quite the intelligence network among the longer-term, less Brenda-entranced residents, was that it was chaos. Brenda, having recovered a shred of her former bluster, tried to paint Watershed Properties LLC as a faceless corporate predator bent on extortion. She shouted about historic rights and thundered, "They can't do this to us. This is Serenity Lake. We are Serenity Lake." But Harold Jenkins, the treasurer, and now personally on the hook for $75,000, looked like he might faint. George Peterson, the accountant I'd once chatted with, finally spoke up. His voice was shaky but clear. "Brenda, with all due respect, These documents include a recorded deed. Did our attorney ever confirm we own the lake? By then, Arthur Jenkins had managed a rush title search. He arrived at the meeting looking pale and grim. His report was damning. Watershed Properties LLC held clear, legally recorded title to Serenity Lake. The HOA's supposed ownership was built on assumptions, not documentation. There had never been a deed transferring the lakebed to the HOA. Worse, when Arthur had reached out to their directors and officers' insurance carrier, he was met with prickly questions about due diligence, misuse of authority, and potential financial misconduct. The room reportedly went cold. The board members who'd rubber-stamped the Serenity Lake Preservation Club now stared down the barrel of personal financial ruin. Brenda, finally faced with facts she couldn't bully her way past, deflated. The notion that some faceless LLC now owned her lake was simply unfathomable. But the face wasn't faceless for long. At the next public HOA meeting, held a week later with record attendance, Sarah attended on behalf of Watershed Properties LLC. She laid out the facts, the deed, the survey, the timeline of trespass. She politely inquired into the legal standing and financial transparency of the Preservation Club, hinting that further investigation could become necessary if matters weren't resolved amicably. The implication landed like a thunderclap. Some residents were confused or angry at this new legal owner, but many more turned their gaze toward Brenda. She said the club was official. Where did all the dues go? She fined people for breaking rules on a lake we didn't even own? Brenda's voice rose in a shrill defense, but no one was listening anymore. Her power crumbled, not in a blaze of glory, but in awkward silence and averted eyes. The negotiations that followed weren't negotiations at all. They were a controlled demolition. My terms through Sarah were firm but fair. Immediate cessation of all unauthorized HOA activities on the lake. Formal dissolution of the Serenity Lake Preservation Club, with a full independent audit of its finances. A public apology to all residents for misrepresenting lake ownership and enforcing illegitimate rules. A substantial payment to Watershed Properties LLC for damages, access violations, and environmental impact. The initial $1.8 million figure was never my true goal. It was leverage and attention getter. We ultimately settled on a figure that stung but didn't destroy. The HOA would fund it through a special assessment. Painful, yes, but an unforgettable lesson. Brenda and the most complicit board members remained personally liable. Their invoices were reduced slightly in negotiation, but they still amounted to significant five-figure sums. Brenda, fearing further exposure from a full financial audit of her little empire, paid hers out of pocket. It wasn't the full $250,000, but it was enough to be a personal and public reckoning. The grand reveal came at the community meeting convened to discuss the settlement. After Sarah laid out the final terms, she said, "And now the principal of Watershed Properties LLC, who, as it happens, is one of your own neighbors, would like to say a few words." All eyes turned. I stood. A collective gasp filled the room. Brenda, seated in the back, looked gaunt. She stared at me, mouth agape. I explained myself. The unjust fine. The principle of the matter. My desire not for revenge but for fairness. I announced the creation of the Serenity Lake Community Trust, which would receive a substantial portion of the HOA's settlement and Brenda's personal contribution. This trust would manage the lake's maintenance, ecological health, and equitable access, for everyone. I, through Watershed Properties LLC, would retain ownership of the lake bed, but would grant a long-term, low-cost lease to the trust. I would serve as one of the founding trustees, alongside respected residents who had never bent the knee to Brenda. There would be a modest annual household fee, not free but far less than the club's exclusive dues. It would fund real preservation, real access, real community. The room exhaled. People nodded. Some even applauded. Brenda McMillan resigned that night. The rest of her board followed within days. A new interim board formed, filled with residents committed to transparency, fairness, and reform. The audit of Brenda's club revealed exactly what we suspected. Sloppy bookkeeping, money spent on private social events, not lake preservation. Not criminal, barely, but damning nonetheless. Her reputation never recovered. She and her husband sold their home and left within 6 months. And the lake? The Serenity Lake Community Trust flourished. We organized cleanup days, fish stocking, and improved access. It became a shared treasure, not a private stage for petty autocrats. My $5,000 fine, once a mark of petty abuse, was formally rescinded and donated, appropriately, as the Trust's first official contribution. Clara and I still take the Wanderer out on the water sometimes. It's peaceful now in every sense. I look across the lake, my lake in title, our lake in spirit, and I smile. It was a long, strange, and expensive road from petty fine to private ownership. But every step was worth it, to dismantle a small tyranny and rebuild something better in its place. So, what's the craziest HOA story you've ever heard? Bet it's hard to top this one. Thanks for watching HOA Confidential Stories. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this slice of suburban justice. Subscribe for more and don't forget to ring that notification bell. Because you never know when the quiet neighbor decides, enough is enough.